You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 416, recorded on Sunday, February 27th, 2022. I'm your host, Rachel, recording from Boise, Idaho, and I am joined by Bill, recording from Newton, Massachusetts. Hi, Bill.
Hello.
On this week's episode, we are talking about cheese and how the Second Industrial Revolution helped pave the way for some of our favorite cheesy foods and snacks. We're taking a deep dive on cream cheese and two of the most famous cream cheese foodstuffs, crab rangoon and cheesecake. In the second half of the episode, Bill discusses government cheese. Although it has taken on a mythic quality, it was a real, actual food item. So, starting off with cream cheese was a second industrial revolution invention, literally a mass production industrial cream cheese product, and it's most known today as Philadelphia cream cheese, the bricks that come in the foil wrappers. But what are the origins of cream cheese? So, cream cheese was invented in 1873 by William A. Lawrence of Chester, New York. In 1872, he had acquired a Neufchâtel factory, and Neufchâtel cheese is kind of a soft, quick-aged cheese. And what he did was he tinkered with the recipe and he added more cream to the Neufchâtel recipe, and this created cream cheese. Cream cheese, unlike Neufchâtel, does not require aging and is meant to be consumed fresh, so it can go right off the assembly line to consumers and get eaten pretty much immediately. In 1877, Lawrence created the first brand of cream cheese, and it was known as Neufchâtel and cream cheese, and the packaging included a logo of a cow silhouette. Lawrence's cream cheese was a success, and in 1879 he joined up with Samuel S. Durland, who was another Chester, New York merchant, and he built a larger factory, and Lawrence and Durland began to sell their cream cheese. In 1880, they teamed up with a distributor, Alva Reynolds, who was a New York cheese distributor, and Reynolds was the one who gave the Lawrence and Durland cheese the name Philadelphia cream cheese. By the end of 1880, demand exceeded supply, and Reynolds began to sell another manufacturer's cheese, Charles Green, who also hailed from Chester, New York, under that Philadelphia brand. In 1892, Reynolds bought the Empire Cheese Company of South Edmeston, New York, to produce cheese under the Philadelphia label. When the Empire factory burned down in 1900, he asked the newly formed Phoenix Cheese Company to produce his cheese instead. In 1903, Reynolds sold the rights to the Philadelphia brand name to Phoenix Cheese Company, which was under the direction of Jason F. Whitney Sr., and the Phoenix Cheese Company did later merge with Kraft in 1928. Kraft is a big name that we'll be coming to again and again throughout this episode. By the early 1880s, Star cream cheese had emerged as Lawrence and Durland's brand, and Green made World and Globe brands of cream cheese. At the turn of the 20th century, New York dairymen were producing cream cheese sold under a number of other brands as well. Triple Cream, which was manufactured by C. Percival, Eagle, manufactured by FX Beaumont, Empire, manufactured by Phoenix Cheese Company, Mohican, manufactured by International Cheese Company, Monroe Cheese Company, which was manufactured by Gross and Hoffman, and Nabob, which was manufactured by F.H. Leggett. So I wanted to highlight two of the most famous food products that feature cream cheese as an ingredient. And the first is crab rangoon, and it has a very interesting history. And I found an Atlas Obscura article that kind of discusses the history of crab rangoon and how it's a uniquely American food stuff that kind of combines our immigrant nature and our love of combining and Americanizing foreign cuisines and how that kind of shapes the formation of crab rangoon. So if you're not familiar, crab rangoon is cream cheese and artificial crab that gets spooned into wonton wrappers, kind of pinched into pouches, and then deep fried, and is often served with an orange sweet and sour sauce. So to understand its origins, we have to go back to the early 20th century. As we've discussed on previous episodes, anti-Chinese racism led to immigration quotas that greatly restricted how many Chinese immigrants could enter the U.S. annually. However, there were merchant visas available where Chinese Americans could bring in workers from China. In 1915, courts ruled that restaurant owners were allowed into this merchant visa program, and an explosion of Chinese restaurants ensued. between 1910 and 1920, it's estimated that the number of Chinese restaurants quadrupled. So, as Chinese restaurants took hold in the US, a Chinese American cuisine started to form. Uh, and this was largely shaped by how much ingredients cost and the availability of ingredients. Um, so in America, oil for deep frying was cheap, as were chicken breasts, which were not an ingredient that were highly prized in traditional Chinese cooking. Other traditional ingredients, on the other hand, such as Szechuan peppercorns, were prohibitively expensive and or difficult to obtain in the States. And also, Chinese chefs started catering toward a white palate, so they would often sweeten dishes and cut out a lot of the spice altogether. Other dishes were invented out of whole cloth in the US, such as chop suey and General Tso's chicken. And the Chinese American restaurant menu, as we know it today, really solidified in the 1950s. At the same time, another mid-century cultural phenomenon was tiki culture. Tiki culture began in the 1930s as a sanitized version of South Pacific culture that was portrayed in Hollywood and marketed to tourists of places such as Hawaii and Polynesia. Also, as World War II veterans came back from the Pacific Theater in the 1940s, tiki culture grew in popularity. One of the most well-known purveyors of tiki culture was Victor Bergeron, the founder of Trader Vic's Tiki Bars, a very well-known famous chain of tiki bars. Bergeron opened the first Trader Vic's in 1937, selling tiki cocktails and a menu that was heavily influenced by Joe Young, a Chinese-American barback who worked there. Alongside a few dishes that nodded to South Pacific cuisine, such as like pineapple spare ribs and pineapple chicken, there were also items like Trader Vic's fried rice and Mogu Maine, so a very Chinese-American influenced menu. Bergeron experimented with the menu and in the 1940s started putting things in wonton wrappers and started deep frying them. From there, it is believed that the crab rangoon was born. Vic's recipe differs from the crab rangoon seen in Chinese American restaurants today. His featured A1 steak sauce and Lingham's chili sauce mixed in with real crab and cream cheese as the filling. And as both tiki and Chinese restaurants enjoyed immense popularity throughout the 50s and 60s, they heavily borrowed from each other's menus. However, as tiki culture faded into obscurity, the crab rangoon lived on in Chinese American restaurants across the country and exists to this day as kind of a guilty pleasure item. You don't think cream cheese and crab would be delicious, but they absolutely are, and I'm a big fan of it, even if it is kind of a low quality dish. It's kind of seen as kind of trashy, but I think it's absolutely amazing. And of course, I couldn't let this pass. The Atlas Obscura article did quote the famous crab rangoon tweet from David J. Roth, talking about how crab rangoon is a preposterous dish. So I highly recommend that you read this article. It will be linked in the show notes, and it's just a very interesting history of crab rangoon. Another cream cheese-based recipe that's super famous is the New York cheesecake. So although cheesecake has existed for many centuries, before the invention and proliferation of cream cheese, cheesecakes were made with curd cheese, such as ricotta, cottage cheese, mascarpone, or the German quark. These cakes had a coarse texture and a fairly bland flavor, often enhanced with flavorings such as lemon, vanilla, and rosewater. An early mention of cream cheese was published in the August-September 1909 issue of the Boston Cooking School magazine, where bakers were instructed to send Neufchâtel or cream cheese through a ricer. However, curd cheese was the base of choice for cheesecakes until the 1930s. In the 1920s, stabilizers such as guar or carob gums were added to cream cheese to help it stay emulsified. Without them, the cream cheese would separate into fat and water when exposed to heat. So cheesecake made with cream cheese without these stabilizers would often have a very grainy texture and just be pretty unappetizing. So after the stabilizers were added, cream cheese-based cheesecake was popularized in New York in the 1930s, and New York-style cheesecake remains popular to this day. They kind of innovated the graham cracker or crushed cookie base to the cheesecake, and that just makes it a hit to this day. It's very, very delicious. Kind of pivoting into other styles of industrialized cheeses, I wanted to take a moment to talk about American cheese, its other processed cheese product cousins, and the Kraft industrial food monopoly. So, the process for making American cheese is traditional cheese is ground up, combined with emulsifying agents and other ingredients, mixed and heated until it forms a quote unquote melted homogeneous mixture. And then it gets pasteurized, so it's heated to a temperature of at least 150 degrees Fahrenheit for a minimum of 30 seconds. Composition requirements of processed American cheese control the percentage of milk fat, moisture, salt, and pH value in the final product, along with specifications for flavor, body and texture, color, and meltability. Processed American cheese is packaged in individually wrapped slices, as unwrapped slices sold in stacks or in unsliced blocks. Individually wrapped slices are formed from processed cheese, which solidifies only between the wrapping medium, which is a detail that I was previously unaware of, so it sounds pretty interesting, and that's kind of why they get the lines from the plastic kind of embedded into the cheese. It's because it's liquid when it's put into those like cheese pockets. So Kraft specifically was the person and his company that introduced the new industrial assembly line processed cheese concept to the United States from Switzerland. So from the Wikipedia page on processed cheese was first developed in Switzerland in 1911 when Walter Gerber and Fritz Stettler, seeking a cheese with longer shelf life and influenced by cheese sauces such as those used in fondue, added sodium citrate to melted Emmentaler cheese and found that the emulsified cheese sauce could be recooled into a solid again. Shortly after, in 1916, Canadian-American businessman James L. Kraft applied for the first U.S. patent covering a new method of processing cheese, which halted the maturation process. So Kraft started his empire about 100 years ago, and Kraft is still one of the huge names in processed cheese. So one of the early competitors to Kraft was Velveeta, and you won't be surprised to learn that barely a decade later they were then acquired by Kraft. So Velveeta was invented in 1918 by Emil Frey of the Monroe Cheese Company in Monroe, New York. I mentioned them previously. They were also in the cream cheese game. In 1923, the quote-unquote Velveeta Cheese Company was incorporated as a separate company. In 1925, it advertised two varieties, Swiss and American, and the firm was purchased by Kraft Foods, Inc. in 1927. So the name Velveeta is meant to connote a velvety smooth food, and its smoothness and meltability were its main selling points. And interestingly enough, the product was advertised as a nutritious health food, and in the 1930s, Velveeta became the first cheese product to gain the American Medical Association's seal of approval. I know I don't really think of Velveeta when I hear the phrase health food, so I'm not entirely sure how exactly they got that AMA seal of approval. Kind of sounds like corporate chicanery to me, probably. They paid for this seal of approval in this health food label. Another big processed cheese food was canned cheese spray, also known as Easy Cheese. Easy Cheese was first manufactured by Nabisco and sold under the name Snackmate from 1965 until 1984. Advertisements often displayed the orange product adorned in flowy peaks atop several different types of appetizers. As a 1966 advertisement says, it was, quote, instant cheese for instant parties, unquote. Another big cheese product is powdered cheese. So it's included in tons of products today. It's on your Cheetos, your Doritos. It's in your packets of Easy Mac or other mac and cheese products. You sprinkle it on your popcorn. So where did cheese powder come from? The first real cheese powder was developed in 1943 by George Sanders, a USDA dairy scientist. Even before the war began, USDA's research facilities had been enlisted to work toward military goals, exhorted by Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace, quote, to consider their possible contributions to national needs as the defense program approaches the stage of maximum effort, end quote. This relationship continues to this day. The USDA has collaborated with the Quartermaster Corps and later the NATIC Center on topics as varied as chemical testing, fungi collection and classification, potatoes, dairy, and, from 1980 on, operation of the Army's Radiation Food Sterilization Program. Until then, it had been considered impossible to dehydrate natural fat-containing cheese because the heat melted the fat, which then separated out. Sanders' innovation was to divide the process into two steps. In the first, the cheese, shredded or grated, was dried at a low temperature. This hardened the surface proteins of the particles, forming a protective barrier around the lipids. Once sufficient water had been evaporated, the cheese was ground and dehydrated at a higher temperature. The final step was to form it into what the patent describes as cakes. A 1943 war bond ad unveiled the product to the public with a picture of a bare-chested soldier feeding a second soldier bundled up in a parka with a cheesecake on a pointy stick. A number of companies claim to have soon led the way in cheese powders, in particular a Danish processed food company, Lactosan. According to the company, after one of its customers returned an order of processed cheese because he had nowhere to store it, a factory manager, Christian Jessen, began experimenting with melted cheese and industrial spray dryers, producing what we recognize as modern cheese powder in 1951. It was so successful that the company gave up on manufacturing regular processed cheese to focus on powder. In the United States, Commercial Creamery, the proud owner of cheesepowder.com, claims to have pioneered the manufacturing of cheese powders for the food industry over 60 years ago. And the last processed cheese product I want to talk about is Colby cheese. So Colby cheese was invented in 1882 in Colby, Wisconsin. So Ambrose and Susan Steinwand established a cheese factory in Colby, Wisconsin in 1882 on a 160-acre site they had purchased 5 years before. The Steinwand's son Joseph developed Colby cheese at the factory in 1885 when he was handling a batch of cheddar cheese and washed the curd with cold water. There are differing accounts on whether the creation was intentional. According to some sources, Joseph had attended a cheese-making course and was specifically interested in developing a new type of cheese. According to others, he neglected to drain the excess moisture after adding cold water and accidentally discovering the result. The resulting cheese, which was moister than cheddar, was named after the nearby city and quickly became popular because it did not involve the complicated cheddaring process. So the cheddaring process is when wheels of cheese that have had some of the whey removed are then stacked in piles and pressed together to remove any excess moisture. And this is a time-consuming and long process. So being able to skip this cheddaring process got the cheese to market that much faster. And by 1896, the family was producing $3,000 a year worth of cheese a year, and that is equivalent to $93,324 in 2020. So it was a highly lucrative cheese-making operation. That's kind of a rundown on some of the most popular processed cheese products.
So there isn't much that's more American than American cheese. And in fact, its roots go back to this colonial era and revolutionary era Yankee cheddar or American cheddar that became, along with the just aforementioned Colby cheese, the foundation of the industrial version of that American cheese that we know today that emerges in the 20th century alongside things like cream cheese as well. So we're seeing these sort of through lines and threads coming together over the course of American history, and particularly the Second Industrial Revolution. And we also see, as part of that, that after the sort of big wave of trust busting has ended, this is when the industrial cheeses find their monopoly company in the form of Kraft, which today is Mondelez International, a multi-billion-dollar corporation that gradually had acquired or merged with various entities over the years. under Mr. Kraft himself, and then just as a corporation long after that. And so this goes up in the pantheon with all these other companies we've talked about in previous episodes. Carrier Air Conditioners, Standard Oil, American Tobacco Company, the American Sugar Refinery, also known as the Sugar Trust. In this case, though, because of the timing, emerging in the 1910s, emerging in the 1920s, or at least consolidating in the 1920s, they sort of miss out on a lot of that trust busting, which probably accounts for them achieving such a giant monopoly status within the private sector. But it is now time to talk about the great monopoly in the sky, the monopoly to end all monopolies, the United States government, which, about a little over a century after industrial cheese started being mass-produced in the form of cream cheese, as we talked about earlier in the episode, decided to get into the cheese game as a not exactly a producer, but certainly a distributor under its own branding, which probably would have been a surprise to a lot of people that was how things ended up going. But government cheese was part of a price stability program, and I'd like people to, if they have not already, definitely give a listen to our most recent episode from my 1970s bonus series on the various economic disruptions of the 1970s and the policy solutions that were experimented with or rejected and undertaken and so forth. And one of the points that I made in the price controls episode, which was the most recent episode, is that they stopped doing price controls, but that doesn't mean they stopped doing price manipulation. And things like price stability programs in the field of agriculture is an example of that. But instead of controlling the price directly, you do things like pay subsidies to producers and then buy up certain quantities of production and so forth. And one of the other points that I made in the price controls episode, in terms of talking about how the situation resolved itself after the 1970s, is that the solutions after the 1970s go around the problems instead of dealing with them directly. And in this case, we see this via government-commissioned cheese blocks that are then turned over to food assistance programs, and these are steps taken instead of price controls and a functioning welfare state. So let's talk about government cheese. Obviously, there are longer roots that predate the 1970s that set the stage for this, particularly through the Commodity Credit Corporation. Now, of course, U.S. food purchase and farm stabilization programs actually begin back in the New Deal in 1933. The Commodity Credit Corporation comes out of that, but it was reorganized after new legislation in 1948, just ahead of Truman's Fair Deal period. So quoting now from a History Channel website article, the cheesy story of government cheese all started in 1949. The Agricultural Act of 1949 gave the Commodity Credit Corporation, a government-owned corporation dedicated to stabilizing farm incomes, the authority to purchase dairy products like cheese from farmers. The CCC had been around since the Great Depression, when it was created as part of the New Deal's attempt to stabilize prices and help farmers. During the 1970s, as Americans sat in long gas lines and watched the economy tank, they faced another crisis, an unprecedented shortage of dairy products. In 1973, dairy prices shot up 30% as the price of other foods inflated. When the government tried to intervene, prices fell so low that the dairy industry balked. Then, in 1977, under President Jimmy Carter, the government set a new subsidy policy that poured $2 billion into the dairy industry in just 4 years. Suddenly, dairy farmers who had been hurting were flush with cash and producing as much milk as they could in order to take advantage of government support. The government purchased the milk dairy farmers couldn't sell and began to process it into cheese, butter, and dehydrated milk powder. Basically, the reason for that was that it was easier to store than in its milk form in liquid. Continuing with the article. As dairy farmers produced more and more, stockpiles ballooned. As anthropologist Bradley N. Jones notes, eventually the stockpile hit over 500 million pounds, stored in hundreds of warehouses in 35 states. As officials scrambled behind the scenes to figure out how to deal with the cheesy conundrum became public when Agriculture Secretary John R. Bach showed up at a White House event with a 5-pound block of greening moldy cheese and showed it to the press. "We've got 60 million of these that the government owns," he said. "It's moldy, it's deteriorating, we can't find a market for it, we can't sell it, and we're looking to try to give some of it away." As the public got wind of the existence of all that surplus cheese, it began to sharply criticize President Ronald Reagan. He had been elected in part by bandying about inaccurate stereotypes of welfare queens and poor people who gamed the system, and earlier in 1981 had pledged to reduce the federal food stamp program. There were hungry Americans still suffering from the after effects of recession. Why not give them the cheese? And this is, of course, quite interesting to us because this is basically the quintessential example of American capitalist central planning. And of course, you can find if you Google that there's various sort of libertarian or Austrian school articles that are going on and on about how this demonstrates the mistakes of getting involved and doing central planning and so forth, and that we need to free the markets. But we saw that there were obviously problems earlier in the 1970s without the government intervention. The problem is that if you had a government that actually cared about social welfare when it did these central interventions, then their first instinct would be to use it to feed the people and not to let it just rot away and mold in warehouses, which is crazy. And eventually, even Ronald Reagan's administration had to sort of bend to that pressure. The CNBC notes that in the 1970s, the USDA had stepped in to control volatile milk prices, and it became very profitable to produce milk, so farmers started producing way too much of it, which was then turned into way too much cheese. In late 1981, then President Ronald Reagan declared 30 million pounds of American cheese would be distributed to food pantries, school lunch programs, and other welfare programs. By 1984, the U.S. was storing about 5 pounds of cheese for every American. Pretty crazy. The program was, of course, not just limited to cheese blocks. There was also government butter, powdered milk, flour, and more. And these are all basically products that have now been invented, as Rachel has charted through the course of the 20th century. The USDA has publicly published documents with the specs to producers about the production and storage methods and what does or does not constitute government cheese. It is either an American cheddar cheese or a Colby cheese, both of those being U.S.-invented Second Industrial Revolution cheeses, as we've explained. Some of the guidelines for production are very specific, just as is the case within the private sector for producing things like American cheese. There are precise requirements about salt, moisture, pH, milk fat, temperature, and so on. But some are extremely vague, such as, quote, "Its flavor shall be pleasing and characteristic of processed cheese, made from mild to medium cured American cheese, and shall be free from undesirable flavors and odors," end quote. Or, quote, "The body shall be smooth, medium firm, resilient, and free of pinholes, crystals, or openings, except those caused by trapped steam. Its texture shall be close and free from lumps, graininess, or uncooked particles, must slice freely, show not more than slight brittleness or roughness, and the cheese shall not stick to the knife or break when cut into approximately 1/8 inch slices," end quote. This meant it tended to be used, at least by consumers, in melted forms such as nachos, grilled cheese sandwiches, mac and cheese, and omelets. One more quote from the USDA documents, quote, "The processed cheese shall have a uniform medium yellow color and an attractive sheen. No visible signs of mold shall be permitted," end quote. Quoting now from a Vice.com article on what happened to government cheese, in the 90s, when the herd buyouts ended and the dairy market stabilized, there was little need for the government to continue its cheese hoarding. According to Ken Vorgert, chief of the dairy grading branch of the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, the donation programs dwindled once the government no longer had its cheap reserves. So you might think that's the end of it, but of course these things tend to go in cycles, right? You know, the market stabilizes for a while and then there's booms and busts and so on. So the private sector continued to try to figure out how to at least non-governmentally unload their dairy surpluses in the 1990s, even if it was not as large of a dairy surplus. And they got some USDA approval and even some financing to try to figure out how to do this. This led directly to very public things that we all know if we're of a certain age, like the famous or infamous Got Milk ad campaigns, as well as to much less public developments, which an article from Pacific Standard magazine, psmag.com, sort of suggested or framed as arguably more nefarious, such as dairy industry specialists working directly inside giant corporate fast food chains to develop new fast food products that included higher dairy content. These, quote, include Domino's 7 cheese pizzas and Taco Bell's very cheesy quesalupa, end quote. This didn't exactly help with improving nutritional intake quality in urban food deserts where poor and minority populations were consuming a lot of fast food. And as we'll circle back to in a moment, the private sector alone was really only able to absorb dairy surpluses for so long. Now, Bobby Dempsey published a beautiful essay in August 2018 at tastecooking.com entitled The Tyranny and the Comfort of Government Cheese, saying that it was, quote, both a cornerstone of survival and an object that inspires complicated tinges of nostalgia for those who grew up poor in the 1980s and early 1990s. Quote, the telltale brick-shaped carton encasing a day-glow orange matter that provided equal parts sustenance and humiliation. Government cheese, end quote. The essay also talks about the many continued pop cultural references to it in music, and even served on Wahlburgers chain burgers because the Wahlberg family also grew up eating it. The essay also notes that in recent years under the Trump administration, government cheese returned to programs that provide food to elderly people, and a plan was floated to give it to SNAP recipients in a prepared box of various surplus farm products, but only if SNAP benefits were also cut in half each month instead, which is obviously a bad and cruel plan. So why did government cheese have to make a comeback? Well, this development under Trump followed late Obama-era reorganization of regular farm subsidies and also a round of Trump-era ad hoc farm subsidies, generally flowing to major agribusiness corporations, supposedly to offset the effects of a trade war with China. Now, some of these measures were suspended under Biden, but you can read an article that we'll link in the notes from the Environmental Working Group going over some of these various rounds of subsidies and how this led to these agricultural and particularly dairy surpluses once again, although we can see that this was already, the trend heading in that direction before then. In 2020, 39% of all net farm income in the United States came from direct government aid, including not just subsidies, but also CARES Act aid, which led not merely to relief from bankruptcy risk that some farms had been facing before the pandemic, but in fact to record profits in 2020. Again, not to sound like a libertarian here, because that's absolutely not the point, but the idea that price controls ending meant the end of price manipulations is just not true at all. And the dairy industry is sort of one of the most clear-cut examples. People care a lot about the price of milk going up or down. They care a lot about making sure that babies have milk available and that kind of thing, right? And there's all these sort of other ripple effects. And the U.S. government intervenes heavily and has for decades. And there's sometimes when it's less, sometimes when it's more. Right now we're back in a period of more. But this is definitely not a free market sector. Again, not saying that the point is that it should be, but just that we should be honest about what it is, and we should make policy that is maximally beneficial to the greatest number of people and, the greater good for society, not just flowing to the benefit of these major agribusiness corporations, as noted in the EWG article. By 2019, the U.S. dairy surplus had returned stronger than ever with 1.4 billion pounds of cheese in storage. That is, of course, vastly more than the amount at the peak in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when the government cheese program was started. And this was not just a result of production levels, this surplus, but also declining demand. Americans have been generally cutting dairy and especially processed cheese from their diets in greater quantities, according to that Pacific Standard Magazine article. Returning, though, to the Vice Magazine article from 2014, which was republished in 2018, they recalled that one of the other pop cultural references to government cheese was about one of its nastier side effects that government policymakers had apparently not taken into consideration. Quote, perhaps more importantly, any type of cheese can be problematic for the digestive system of millions of Americans. According to the University of Georgia, 75% of African Americans, 51% of Latinos, and 80% of Asian Americans are lactose intolerant versus the 21% of Caucasians. And because minorities historically have been heavily represented in welfare programs, the government wasn't really doing Americans' butts a favor. End quote. This lactose intolerance problem from government cheese consumption was apparently even referenced in a sketch from the 90s black sketch comedy show In Living Color. I won't get into the details of the joke of the sketch because it's obviously a little off color, but you can fill in the blanks yourself there. So Rachel, I'll turn back to you now. This was not something that I really had any sort of detailed awareness of. I actually know some other things about the dairy markets and government interventions from the supply and producer side, but I didn't really know that they were turning around and, not just limiting the price of milk and things like that, but actually producing, or at least contracting out to produce, their own vast stockpiles of cheese that they were then eventually rolling into benefits programs.
Yeah, I never have seen government cheese in the flesh, but I have seen many pictures of it, and it's just like, yeah, this plain brown paper wrapped uh, brick of cheese. And I don't think I realized like the extent of the surplus, like 5 pounds of cheese for every American. That's an insane amount of cheese. And I don't think looking back now, it's quite obvious that the Got Milk campaign was basically a government op. But
Well, it was a private sector op with government support and
right.
financing, like all
Yes.
good ops.
Yes. And it's interesting because it did really penetrate pop culture so much in the 90s and the 2000 early 2000s. Like I can still remember Who Shot Alexander Hamilton, not because of the Hamilton musical, but because of the famous Got Milk ad where the man had just taken a big bite of a peanut butter sandwich and he was going to win a big radio contest, but he could not say Aaron Burr around his mouthful of peanut butter. So I'm sure something very important got pushed out of my brain to make space for that ad. But it's really interesting how well that marketing campaign worked and how people kind of saw milk as like this chic lifestyle product. Like the calcium was good for your bones and the protein was good for your workout. It really did become this wellness item basically, even though the nutritional like facts of milk aren't quite as rosy as those ads portray. So it's kind of interesting, and the fact that so many people are lactose intolerant, that if you just go around giving people a whole bunch of cheap cheese and milk, that's obviously not good nutritionally as well. So yeah, this was a pretty interesting discussion. And I wonder if we will actually see the return of government cheese, not just in a Trump era program, but in some sort of other food assistance program that doesn't seek to slash benefits in half.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, we know, like, in the background of all this is that there's no, you're not buying bottles of corn syrup labeled government corn on the grocery shelf, so it's a little bit different, but the government is vastly subsidizing the use of corn syrup in the private sector as a means of stabilizing and promoting corn production in this country. I mean, that's a similar phenomenon. It's just, this is such an interesting one because of how out in the open that it was, and literally having the packages, the plain packages that say USDA government cheese or some variant thereof, right? It's very much just like outright saying, yep, this is the government monopoly cheese. Enjoy. And if you get slightly more money, then maybe you'll be able to buy private sector cheese that's basically almost exactly the same from Kraft or now Mondelez International.
Yeah, I don't think I realized I kind of pictured this vastly inferior product, but it is basically American cheese from Kraft. So it is interesting, even though it's so denigrated. I think it's denigrated because of its packaging and how it looked versus the actual content, because that was something that was available on grocery store aisles as well. So
Well,
yeah.
well, and it speaks to the sort of peak industrialization aspect of this, which is that it's all standardized, right?
Mhm.
That you have exact specifications, and you talked about that separately from me talking about it, which is that you have the exact specifications of those things like pH levels, milk fat percentage, whether it has holes or not, what the smoothness quality is, all these sort of specific aspects of it are very tightly standardized, not just to facilitate production, but also so that everyone on the consumer side knows exactly what they're getting every single time. The one big distinction that apparently government cheese had is that there was some variation in terms of the consistency of it, the exact sort of level of sheen, which is kind of a gross thing to think about, and whether it was more of a Colby or more of an American cheddar. There was some variation there, probably because they're getting it. I would imagine they were contracting out production. I don't think they had their own USDA factories. I could be wrong, but I didn't see that referenced anywhere. And so there may have been some variation there compared to the standardization within a single corporation like Kraft. But within those parameters, you're getting relative consistency more or less, and that is, it's the government is doing the same thing essentially that the private sector is doing.
Yeah, that's something I kept seeing over and over again was like the USDA standards for what you can call a certain product. So, like American cheese is often called like American processed cheese product or cheese byproduct or something. And that's just because there are very strict standards for what you can call a cheese versus a cheese product or a cheese byproduct. So it's kind of interesting. I think that's something that's kind of made fun of how American cheese is called a cheese product and not a cheese, but that is just because those are the standards that the USDA has set for what we can call a cheese.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on this week to help me talk about industrial cheeses, things of that nature. Preposterous.
Glad to be here and glad to talk about this fascinating subject.